Hey there. Thank you so much for coming to watch this interview with Mr. Stephen Moore. Before jumping in, I just wanted to make a quick note about the end of the interview and a technical glitch we encountered. So Mr. Moore was traveling when we recorded this, and he shot the interview from outside, and the computer he was calling on died while he was in the middle of answering the last question. So unfortunate, but he reached back out and recorded his full answer as well as some closing thoughts. And we just attached that to the end of the pre-recorded interview. So just wanted to fill you in because you'll obviously notice him drop out of the interview halfway through and then pop back up again in another setting. So that's what that's all about. But with that out of the way, please enjoy the interview. It's great. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching today. My name is Jack Light with the Roosevelt Group's events team, and we're super honored to be joined here remotely by Mr. Stephen Moore. Mr. Moore is a highly experienced strategist and political consultant, and his work has taken him around the world, including to multiple war zones. For nearly 10 years, he worked on Capitol Hill, including as Chief of Staff for House Deputy Whip Peter Roscom and Majority Whip Kevin McCarthy. He's worked in the McCain Institute for Global Leadership and as VP of Government Affairs at Data Robot, and he now leads the Ukraine Freedom Project, which he founded just days after Russia's invasion in 2022, and which has brought over $1 million worth of equipment in support of Ukraine so far. He's one of the most powerful behind the scenes Ukraine advocates in the U.S. government, and it's just a great privilege to have him here to share some of his story with us. So, Mr. Moore, thank you so much. And I guess just to kick things off, it's kind of hard to compress your career into a couple lines. So I guess if there's anything you wanna share, give us just a quick rundown of your career just to get us rolling.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever had a career. I've done a series of interesting things, and so yeah, so people that have careers climb the corporate ladder or go the way that things are supposed to go. And I've just kind of done, that looks cool. I think I'll go do that. So that's what my career's been like.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I guess, that sort of brings us to two quick things I'd like to touch on before we get to the Ukraine Freedom Project, that have
Sure.
strike me as particularly interesting. I understand that you were a campaign strategist for Boris Yeltsin way back when, and that just sounds, for most of us here, that sounds incredibly far out. And I think if we got asked to do that, we would have absolutely no idea where to start. So I was just curious if you could give us a little insight and maybe what impression that gave you of the Russian government, Russian society, and maybe how that's influenced, your perception of what's happening right now.
Yeah. So in 1996, I was one of a small team of American consultants that secretly advised Boris Yeltsin's campaign for president. And I was very young. All the guys uh, that were actually running the show, there's four of us, and I was the young guy, and there was three older guys. I was in my 20s at the time, and it was super interesting. We went there. It was the second ever election in Russia, and we when we got there, Boris was at fifth place in the polls at 6%. And ultimately, he won, I think, by 13 points over the communist. And this was back in the day when they were actually communist, in Russia. And so some of the things that stick out for me is that there was a overdeveloped sense of um, superiority among Russians and an unearned sense of pure superiority. Like, for instance, they were always really hard to work with and very arrogant. But, there was days when I couldn't dial a number starting with two because just the two didn't work on any telephone, you know. So the phone company messed up the number two, right? And so there's this kind of like broad scale ineptitude in Russia, and we're working with the very top leaders of the country, and Russia is a country that has an unearned sense of superiority.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And do you think that that sense of superiority was sort of specific to, perhaps you and people in a position like you, where they viewed you as, oh, an outside political consultant, or was it more of, a more general sense of superiority to the rest of the world around them?
Yeah, there is a sense among Russians that Russians should rule. You know, there is, you know, Tucker Carlson just got on and interviewed Vladimir Putin, And and what Vladimir Putin said to Tucker Carlson is vastly different than what he says to domestic audiences. And is one example. He's on there. He's like, "Gosh, Tucker, I was trying to make peace. I'm just a peaceful guy, But when you look at what he's doing in Russia right now, his campaign slogan is Russia's borders have no bounds.
Mhm.
Does that sound like a peaceful guy? you know,
Mhm.
so and he has said many times that he is going to invade Poland, the Baltic states, Finland after he's done in Ukraine. And in fact, they're conducting probing operations into Latvia and Finland both right now. So,
Mhm.
yeah, so he's an aggressive man.
Yeah, yeah, that's so interesting, and I'm sure we'll circle back to that imminently when we come to the Ukraine Freedom Project. But I also just wanted to touch on your work with Data Robot because it was an AI company that you were involved with a little bit before this sort of revolution that sprung up around AI in the last year or so, and then also you were involved in some of the modeling for COVID that AI project did. So just curious if you could tell us a little bit about that because two super important issues.
Yeah, I somehow always find myself at the center of the action, and I, I was in Ukraine in 2018, 2019. I was had a job there, and I spent a year in Kiev, and then coincidentally, I met the CEO of Data Robot in Kiev, and he wanted me to come to work for him. He's like, "Wow, what you do is super interesting. Why don't you come to work for us?" So I was like, AI sounds interesting. And so I went and did it. And so one of the things that happened was that the when we got so I got there in 2020, no, 2019 in like September. And then of course COVID hit in, January, February, or whatever it was of 2020. And I had heard from all these data scientists for several months that we got the best data scientists in the world. We can model anything and blah, blah, blah. Right. So I was like, okay, this is it. This is your time. The people I speak to in the administration, the people I speak to on Capitol Hill need to know where this is going. So, you guys need to model it. And so we created a model that we sold to the Health and Human Services administration for like 20 million bucks. And it was the most accurate model predicting the spread of the coronavirus. And we used it to target recruitment for the vaccine program. And so, um, you need to target the people that are most likely to get sick, because the sooner you get people that are sick with the vaccine, then the sooner the trials are over and you can figure out whether they're working or not. And so, for instance, you and I probably would have been bad candidates for the trials because we were sitting in our spare bedrooms on Zoom calls all days, right? So, but we helped them target the people that are most likely to get sick. We figured we shaved about 8 weeks off the clinical trials. So, I don't know how many lives we saved, but we saved a few.
Yeah, that's incredible. Oh, do you think that work on AI and just sort of AI in generally has impacted your current work for the Ukraine Freedom Project?
Yeah, I've always been a data guy ever, before it was cool. And so I've done a lot of public opinion research. I've always looked at the data. And in 2013, I was awarded the Campaigns and Elections magazine awarded me the Innovator of the Year award for data mining constituent contacts on Capitol Hill. So when you get, every year you get, 30,000 phone calls, 30,000 emails, 10,000 pieces of mail, that sort of thing, your constituents write into you. And so what we figured out is how to data mine that and most effectively communicate with your constituents using that. So, and that was, before AI. And so, I still use a lot of data in what I'm doing. Everything. So the advantage I have over other people that are communicating about Ukraine, particularly the people that are communicating falsely about Ukraine, is that I'm in Ukraine, although clearly I'm not now. No palm trees in Ukraine, right? So yes, palm trees. None of them. These are not Ukrainian palm trees. But um, but I'm in Ukraine, and everything I say is either firsthand experience or data driven. And so that's what I do. That's what I have credibility about when I talk about Ukraine.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And exactly like you say, you sort of jumping from one hotspot to the other and kind of bridging the gap between public and private work too, which I find super interesting.
Yeah, man, you speak as though I had a plan. So just interesting things tend to happen to me.
Oh, that's great. Well, yeah, so I
Yeah.
guess we'll just move right along to the Ukraine Freedom Project. So what was your experience like in the country before the invasion and before you started the organization?
Yeah, I was doing public opinion research in Ukraine, and I was there for a year, and so made a lot of Ukrainian friends, and and then when the war broke out, I had actually just left at a robot, and so I had some time on my hands, and I was kind of trying to figure out, like, what am I gonna do with the rest of my winter? Do I go skiing in the Rockies, go skiing in the Alps, and then my friends are calling me and they're saying, like, they're bombing Kyiv. I don't know what to do. And I had been uh I had been in Iraq at the beginning of that war, and so I knew what to do. So I jumped on a plane. I came across the Ukrainian border at a place called Chernivtsi, stayed there for a few weeks, and thought I was going to do a refugee crisis thing, right? I thought that there was going to be, millions of people flowing out, and there was. But after about 3 weeks, I came there to get my friends out, right? My friends were unsafe, and so I helped them get out. And after a few weeks, all my friends that wanted to be safe were safe. So I it's like, what do I do now? Like, do I claim victory and go home? And what I found was that international organizations that you might expect to be effective were radically underperforming. And so I ended up, instead of like, for instance, Kyiv, I got medicine to the front in Kyiv, and a lot of people like me. And we didn't have the volume that the ICRC, the Red Cross did, but we were doing what we could because they weren't there. And similarly, the UN food program, the World Food Program did a really good job. So I got nothing unkind to say about them. But mostly, the international organizations that you would expect to be effective were not. So I just started filling in the gaps everywhere I could, and I was trying to solve problems that, like, most aid workers couldn't solve. I spent 7 years in Capitol Hill, and have a lot of friends that are lobbyists, and you know can reach out to, so can you hear me?
Hey, Mr. Moore. Yeah, sorry. I think we lost you for just about like 20 seconds there. Just as
Yeah,
you
that's probably the Russians.
they know this is happening. But yeah, it was
Yeah.
just when you were talking about how when you were working on Capitol Hill, and how that sort of related to
Yeah.
the big organizations.
Yeah, so I had, so I have friends on Capitol Hill that are well connected, and when I encounter problems, one example, there was a local manufacturer of body armor in Ukraine that was using steel plates for body armor, and uh, their shipments of steel were not getting prioritized. They're like, yeah, we'll get your next shipment in 6 months. And so I was able to call their lobbyist and say, hey, look, these guys are making body armor at cost, and for $220, and a normal price for body armor is like $500, and there was war profiteers selling body armor for like $1,400. So I just said, look, are the people that are ahead of us in line for the steel, are they people that are selling it at cost, like my friends in Ukraine, or are they the people that are the war profiteers that are selling it for $1,400? And they said, you're right, we should prioritize your shipments. And so they did. And so we got a lot of body armor and people that may not have gotten it otherwise.
Wow, that's amazing. And do you think that you
Yeah.
could diagnose as someone who was on the ground, like why the larger organizations were ineffective? And do you think that those are problems that can be fixed, or is it just sort of their nature? And by consequence, it's necessary to have small organizations like yours to fill the gaps.
Yeah. Yeah, there's the really frustrating thing for me was like, for instance, uh specifically how I got involved in bringing medicine to the front was that I a friend of a friend called me and said, hey, I'm helping this small clinic outside of Kyiv, and we're taking wounded from the war, and we're not set up for that. We're like here to fix broken arms and cure people's colds. Can you help us get some medical supplies? And I don't want to go to the front, man. You know, call the Red Cross. And he's like, who? And so I ended up putting about $6,000 of credit of medical supplies on my credit card and driving it up to Kyiv. And I got there, and sure enough, there was nothing from the Red Cross. But then I went back and sort of got on my computer and said, what's going on with these people? And they'd raised a ton of money off of, "Oh, we're helping Ukraine," but they weren't there. So you know, at some point you got to figure that they knew they weren't there, yet they were raising money. And so that seems to me to be dishonest.
Mhm.
Maybe I'm old fashioned.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so I guess when you first started out there and you were sort of in Ukraine helping get your friends out, the risk level must have been pretty high at that point, right?
Yeah. Yeah. There was um I've been under shelling many times, both in Iraq and in Ukraine. And at that point, I had no idea how close to the front I was, but it was ground shaking artillery rounds. And later, I came back to that area that after it was liberated from Russian control, and I'm driving around. I'm like, wow, look at that, man! Look at all those buildings that are blown up, man. Look at it. It looks like there's a really big battle around here. And it's like, holy smokes! That's the clinic I was at. So I was like, I don't know, man, like 500 meters in front, 1 kilometer. I really don't know. It was super close. And yeah, it was pretty intense.
Wow, that's unbelievable. And then could you
Yeah.
just walk through sort of the logistics of starting an organization under those conditions? Because obviously, possible for you to do just sort of heroic individual acts, driving medical supplies that you've bought, helping your friends out. But what's it like building an organization under those conditions?
Yeah. Here's what it's like. You look in your bank account and you say, man, I've spent a lot of my own money. I need to figure out how to raise money to be more effective. And then you set up I had gotten in with a friend of mine, a 501(c)(3) in San Diego called the San Diego County Prosperity Foundation with TJ Zane, who everyone should give a round of applause to. Great guy. But he helped me sort of organize things in such a way that I could raise money. And so I did that through him. And so then, other than that, the hard part about doing it in Ukraine was that we really didn't have enough money to like hire full-time people. We brought on some people here and there, and but um we didn't we so a lot of volunteers and a lot of people drifting in and out, and so yeah. And so we so it was difficult for to maintain continuity, and it was frustrating for me because I was pretty much the single point of continuity in the thing. And I'd find someone, like I had a great guy Tolik, short for Anatoly, and Tolik was awesome. And we were like Batman and Robin cruising through Ukraine and helping people. And then in June, Tolik's wife came back because it was safe to come back, and she's like, no, no, no. You're not going to go run around Ukraine anymore with Stephen. You got two kids, and so Tolik, so that crippled my organization. And but you can imagine,
Yeah, but obviously definitely a hard situation to be in because I imagine the threat level sort of all over was still super high at that point, right?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
oh
well,
yeah.
that
Well, so yeah, so after like the end of March 26th was the zenith of Russian occupation in Ukraine, March 26, 2022. And at that time there was uh like just a there was just a lot. I'll show you a map if I can find it real quick. And uh, and here we go. So an older map. It's not a current map, but it'll give you a sense of it. Can I screen share?
I
Yeah,
should be able to.
yeah, no, you need to enable me.
Sorry, I think.
Yeah, no worries. Um, let's see. I don't know how to. There we go. No, that's AI companion. Yeah, don't sweat it, but I'll give you a sense of it. I'll talk you through it. So on March 26th, it was the most occupied that Ukraine was by Russians, and there was the Kyiv was surrounded on three sides, and the most of the country was like around the edges of the country was painted red. Um, and then in April, the Ukrainians pushed the Russians out of Kyiv, and and pushed the front back 800 miles. Not a lot of people recognize because in America, no one's showing you a map every day, and no one is uh, telling you what's going on. And there's a bunch of places you hear that funny sounding city names like Avdiivka and Bakhmut and Kramatorsk and Kharkiv and all these places. And how are you supposed to know where these are? But we have given the Ukrainians at this point $42 billion in weapons. And with that money, they pushed the Russians back 800 miles and taken control back of all but 17% of the country's territory. And in that 17%, 83% of the country is actually in pretty good shape. I mean, it's pretty highly functioning. But in that 17%, all the most horrible things in the world you can imagine are happening there. It's like every time I go to the front, I hear stories, and they're worse than the ones before. I just think the Russians can't do anything worse, and they do. So, but there's 93,000 reports of rape and sexual abuse at the hands of the Russians. And I'm not just talking like women, I'm talking like men, women, little boys, little girls. Old women actually are being raped at a disproportionate rate because old women can't run. When the Russians are coming, they're like, I'm just going to stay here. I lived through the Soviet Union. I'll live through this. And it turns out to be a bad idea. And it squares with my experience because whenever I go to these places have been recently liberated, I see a bunch of old people. So they're torturing and murdering Ukrainian Protestants for their faith. And I'll tell you how that goes. There's about 1.5 million Protestants in Ukraine, or at least there was at the beginning of the war, and they cluster around the southeast in the places that are occupied right now. And the Russian Orthodox Church is not a church as you and I would imagine it. The patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church has said, people who die fighting in Ukraine will have all their sins washed away. I mean, doesn't that kind of sound like ISIS or something? And you'll get 72 virgins, and so and Russian priests bless tanks, and there's a debate in the Russian Orthodox Church as to whether or not they should be blessing nuclear weapons. And so they're a working arm of the Kremlin. So when Russian soldiers go into places like Melitopol, Mariupol, they meet Baptists, they meet Presbyterians and all types of evangelicals, and they say, this is an American religion. You must be an agent of the American government, like our guys are agents of the Kremlin. So they arrest them, they torture them, sometimes they murder them, they shut down their churches. And so this is for real. Anybody that's interested in seeing more about that should go to our website, russiatorturschristians.org. Excuse me. So, but as I said, there's 19,000 children that have been abducted by the Russians, and these are just the ones the Ukrainian government has names for. These are the ones they've identified. So, it's like I said, of horrible thing you can imagine is happening in the occupied territories.
Wow. So, and I guess it's pretty well known that, tens, hundreds of thousands of Russians have fled from Russia as a result of the war. And I was just curious, have you had any contact with them? Because surely some of them, have come your way, perhaps. And, what are their thoughts about this? How have they been treated when they left? And, what's that situation like?
I've met, so I had the experience. I was waiting for a friend at a train station in Poland, just off across the border, and I saw a volunteer there, and she was wearing a volunteer jacket. And I was like, it's like, hey, what are you doing? She's like, oh, I'm volunteer helping refugees. And I was like, great, great. Where are you from? She said, Russia. It's like, what? And there was and there's a part of an organization called Russians for Ukraine, and so there's some good Russians. Unfortunately, uh, you know, here's what you don't see happening is you don't see Russians leaving Russia then protesting. You don't see anyone um, uh, standing up and say Vladimir Putin should stop what he's doing in Ukraine. They just come and they just do whatever it is. They live their lives. And or worse, some of them, there's a lot of incidents in that first year of Ukrainian refugees in Europe being assaulted by Russians. And um, so the Russian propaganda is powerful. It has persuaded people that, Ukraine invaded Russia. And this was a line that Putin gave during the Tucker Carlson interview. It's nonsense. I can assure you there are no Ukrainian tanks in Russia. And there's a lot of Russian tanks in Ukraine. Um, and um, so uh, yeah, I mean, some Russians, there's some folks that are doing good work and trying to push back on Putin. And there's some, again, the Russians have,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, sorry, just lost you
you there?
again.
Hello?
Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah, sorry, just lost you again for another
There you
5.
go.
So,
No,
yeah.
again, it's the Russians. They're after me. So,
Yeah.
uh, yeah. So, where'd I lose you?
Just right there at the end. I think totally got your point there. Which is super
Okay.
interesting. And thanks. I think that's probably, kind of an insight that only someone with your kind of experience would have. So thank you. Thanks for sharing that. I guess
Sure.
circling
Yeah.
back, circling back to your work. So when you first started, were you focused mostly on evacuations of citizens, or were you sort of in another area?
Yeah, I just there because I thought my friends were gonna have trouble getting out, and so I came there to help my friends get out, and and yeah, so uh yeah, so so and again, 3 weeks into it, it was my friends that wanted to be safe were safe, and so I was like, what do I do now? And I just kept doing the humanitarian stuff. Kind of what I've pivoted to now is that I've alluded to the disinformation that's coming, like Tucker Carlson and other. There's just a lot of a lot of bad information coming out of Ukraine. I mean, it ranges from people who are intentionally dishonest, like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and some of the other right-wing commentators, and then even the if you're watching what's happening in Ukraine, what you see is every day there's a story, something blew up today in Ukraine, something blew up today in Ukraine, and so you get the idea. I go back to places like Capitol Hill, and people ask me like, can you get food in Kyiv? And there's some really nice restaurants in Kyiv. Kyiv is a highly functioning city, and it didn't used to be. When I went there in March 2022, there was a military checkpoint every 100 meters, and there was active shelling, and it was pretty grim. And even now in Kyiv, we have to deal with missiles and Iranian drones. But I tell my friends in Washington, D.C., um, that they're more likely to get shot in a drive-by than I am to die of a missile or a drone in Kyiv. So yeah. Um,
Yeah, that's
can you hear me? How am I coming through?
yeah, no,
All
you're perfectly all clear now.
right, good.
So I guess like right now, what's sort of your working balance between DC and Kyiv? Have you sort of pivoted more to spending more time in DC, advocating for funding, things like that?
Yeah, I just got back from DC. I spent I don't know, most of September, October, November, December, and January. I mean, that whole stretch, I was in DC a whole bunch of times back and forth, and we talked to about 100 congressional offices, mostly Republican, and just trying to give them good information about what's happening in Ukraine, so that they can make good decisions.
Mhm.
Um, like let me give you an example. So, since Putin came to power in the year 2000, the U.S. Department of Defense has spent $14 trillion. Okay, that's with a TR, trillion, and every year now they're up to spending almost $1 trillion every year, and so um, and so part of that money has gone to deter Russia, right? And so how much goes to deter Russia? Difficult to say. Let's say 20%. That's $2.8 trillion that the U.S. Department of Defense has spent to deter Russia. And it hasn't worked because Putin has invaded Ukraine twice, Georgia once. He's gone and destabilized Syria. He has helped Hamas and has pledged to help Hamas more. And the Iranians are sending him drones, and they've got a working relationship military wise with the Iranians. And so the $2.8 trillion that we spent to deter Russia did not deter Russia. You know what has deterred Russia? The $42 billion in weapons, which is a tiny fraction of the $2.8 trillion that we spent. The $42 billion that we spent sending weapons to Ukraine, for that amount of money, they have like decimated the Russian war machine by half. They've taken out like 5,000 tanks, something like 350,000 people. Um, the Russians are using World War II era tanks in Donbass. There's pictures of this. They're coming on railroad cars. So they are not doing well. That being said, they have retooled their entire economy for military production. So Russia is not done. They have said they're going to go into Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and you kind of got to believe them.
Mhm. Yeah. So do you know sort of right now, Russia's obviously making a lot of its own military supplies, but how much proportionally is coming from places like Iran and how much is, Russian made?
Yeah. So the here's the sources of Russians' weapons. One, Russia is making some number of weapons, which many of them they shouldn't be able to make because they're sanctioned against the parts. But bad actors in Europe and in Asia and America are still sending them parts that are under sanction. Um, and so the big part that the Iranians are sending is drones, and they're actually using the information they get from these massive drone attacks in Ukraine to develop better and better drones. And so they're using Ukraine as a testing ground and proving ground for their technology, and they're innovating and they're getting better. Um, and to some degree, we're doing that as well. And we found out, for instance, that our stuff was made to be effective against men in caves in Afghanistan. And Russians have a sophisticated electronic warfare capability. And so, our drones don't work. And so we're finding that out. And, I'm hoping there are people that are innovating in America and taking this as a lesson. Um, so you'd mentioned where else are they coming from? North Korea is sending them a massive amount of weaponry. And the good news about that is that it's much of it is defective. Apparently, they're terrible at making stuff in North Korea. Not
Mhm.
surprising. And yeah, so but it's here's what Americans don't realize is that um Americans are living under the illusion that we have the choice of whether or not to participate in the wars in Europe and the Middle East. And the choice is not yes or no. The choice is when. And the choices, we have are, do we send relatively inexpensive weapons now, or do we send the very precious lives of American sons and daughters to fight in Europe and the Middle East? Because it's going to come to that. And, we can either send weapons to Israel and Ukraine today and let them take on the bad guys, or we can let the bad guys arm up, take more land, and let Putin, use oil money to continue to fuel his war machine, and then we'll send people to fight, Americans to fight at some point in 3 years, 5 years, 7 years.
Yeah. So when you're sort of on Capitol Hill explaining this to policymakers, I guess sort of A, what are the most common objections that you hear? And then B, sort of what's sort of the biggest knowledge gap that American policymakers have compared to you who's, spent a lot of time there? Is it sort of that misconception like you just talked about, or is it, there's sort of more something like kind of substantive, or, what do you sort of hear?
Yeah. I mean, there's more than one member of Congress that said, "Oh, Russia will never go into NATO country." Well, that's not what the NATO countries that are next to Russia think. The countries that are sending the most stuff to Ukraine are Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland. I mean, those countries are all in pushing all their chips to the middle of the table because they know they're next. Recently, the Danish government said, we're just sending all our artillery to Ukraine. And because they get it, they understand what's coming. And yeah, so um, there's a lot of people, particularly right-wing Republicans, who are just living under an illusion. They're not seeing it because, here's what I like to say is that, we are in World War III right now, and the only people acting on that information are North Korea, Iran, Russia, and China. Our adversaries are acting on that information. We are not, because we think that, you know, peace is our birthright. We think that, economic prosperity will continue no matter what we do. And there's a big ocean between us and China, a big ocean between us and Europe. The ocean's not that big anymore. So, and Pearl Harbor does not look today like what it looked like in 1941. Pearl Harbor today probably involves a cyber attack on our infrastructure. It probably involves, just the shutdown of our electrical grid. The Russians apparently have some sort of nuclear device in space. I just read about this. Electromagnetic pulse devices shut down everything. I mean, like, what if they get into uh, our airport? I'm sorry, the air traffic control system and shut it down. Then we have a whole bunch of planes that crash, and it's like 9/11 times 500. So, you know, there is no one thinking this out because we're arguing about where people should go to the bathroom. We're arguing about all kinds of nonsense. I mean, and look, here's a real security problem is there was, far more people crossed our southern border illegally than crossed the Ukrainian border illegally in the last year. Now, the people crossing into Ukraine were better armed, but it's no longer Mexico that the Mexican people that are coming in. It's people from all over the world. There's thousands of people coming from China and Russia and Pakistan and other places where they may not be coming to live the American dream. Quite the contrary, they may be here to do some damage to the American dream. So, again, everybody on all sides is kind of like lackadaisically wandering into World War III.
And yeah, so I guess one more question about sort of, objections to funding. I guess what would your response be to someone who, for example, might say, there's only a certain amount of money. Why isn't it going towards the American southern border instead of to Ukraine?
Yeah. I've heard people say that those people are really bad at math. And you have to understand the scale of spending in the federal government. The federal government is going to spend $6.2 trillion this year. And we looked at a bill that would have taken, that would have increased security at the southern border, increased security in Ukraine, in Taiwan, in Israel, and it's going to cost 100 billion. 100 billion is a tiny, tiny fraction of 6.2 trillion. And you remember COVID? You know how much we spent on COVID? We spent like $20 trillion on COVID. So, anybody that tells you that there's not enough money, I mean, anybody in Washington that voted for all the COVID shutdown and subsidies and all this kind of stuff, has no place to tell us there's no money, right? We're just printing money. And you've got to look at the federal budget. And I encourage everyone that's watching this, probably skews young people, go look it up, because discretionary spending is the money that Congress votes on every year. This is like the national defense and national parks and the Department of Education, all that sort of stuff, right? It's kind of flat. It's going along like this. Now, there's also called mandatory spending, which is Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, welfare, and this is stuff that the federal government just pays every year, and it's going up like this. And so if you're fighting about, and the $100 billion sounds like a lot of money. In the scope of the federal government, it's not. So if you're fighting about, $100 billion, you're ignoring the $4 trillion that is entitlement spending, which is mandatory spending. And so again, this is just not an accurate piece of information.
And then I guess sort of directly related to that, do you run into people who sort of say, there's money for humanitarian aid, money for, just monetary support, but when it comes to sending deadly weaponry or paying for weaponry, that's just sort of, so
quite the opposite. We hear people that they're willing to send military support, but humanitarian aid is not something they're like, let the Europeans send that. So we're interested in sending military aid.
Okay.
And by the way, I'm about to run out of battery power. So if I'd like to blame it on the Russians if I disappear suddenly, but it's poor planning on my part and lack of an outlet where I'm at. So
we'll just go to one more quick question if you have time.
Sure. Yeah.
Sort of just predicting for the future, because I think one of the big questions, and also something that might be dissuading some people from full-blown support of Ukraine, is fear of another war where no one has sort of outlined what success means. So, what does it mean to be successful in Ukraine? Is it sort of a restoration of the pre-2022 border? Is it, something else? Are we trying to push into Russia? And, there doesn't seem to be a clear consensus on that. What are sort of your thoughts about what victory would mean?
Victory in Ukraine. That is a good question. So here is what it looks like from my perspective, and probably the perspective of many Ukrainians. The Russians invaded Ukraine, and the Ukrainians have got back 83% of their territory. But the 17% of Ukraine that is occupied by Russians is that's where some of the most horrible things in the world are happening. There's been some 93,000 calls to the national police reporting incidents of rape and sexual abuse of people ranging from infants to elderly women and children and little boys and everything else. There's been 19,000 Ukrainian children kidnapped by Russians and taken back to Russia. Ukrainian Protestants are being singled out and arrested, tortured, and sometimes murdered for their faith, because the Russians see Protestants, Baptists, Pentecostals, Lutherans, as American religions. And so, since their church, the Russian Orthodox Church, is essentially a working arm of the Kremlin, they think that American religions, Protestants, are agents of the US government. And so they treat them accordingly. So when talking about victory, when talking about peace, you have to take into account all the Ukrainians that are living right now under horrible, horrible conditions in Russian occupied territories. You also have to think about Vladimir Putin, who is currently in violation of any large number of treaties with Ukraine. There's something called the Budapest Memorandum. Google it. In 1994, Russia and the United States and Great Britain and France all signed this agreement that if Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, which at the time it was the third largest holder of nuclear weapons in the world, if Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, these countries would guarantee its territorial integrity. So if Ukraine was attacked, then these countries would come to its rescue. Putin is currently in violation of that, and he's in violation of many, many peace accords from the 2014 invasion, ranging from simple ceasefires to actual, peace agreements. So it's difficult to believe that if Putin agreed to a ceasefire, agreed to a peace, that he would keep it for very long, because he is often said that he, A, wants to take back Ukraine for Russia, and B, that Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Finland, and other nations that border Ukraine and Russia are next on his menu. So, so when you're looking at victory in Ukraine, you've got to look at what's going to stop Putin. And so far, American weapons and Ukrainian bravery have decimated more than half of Putin's warfighting capability. And, we just need to keep going and make sure that Putin is not capable of any further aggression, because Putin is a bully. Bullies don't understand negotiation. Bullies don't understand anything but strength. So when you think of victory in Ukraine, when you think of peace in Ukraine, that's what you need to think about.